Okay. Wow. This is really exciting. It's been a long time since we've had our weekly shir. We've gone through Pesach. We've left Mitzrayim. And I think every year, Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron kind of a little bit hits us by surprise that it's so close to Pesach, because we're just very overwhelmed with Pesach and all the preparations. And then we finally get there and we have this sense of, I'm speaking about myself, this sense of relief and redemption and the Seder and that, family time together after we've worked so hard. And then after Pesach, right around the corner, we have these very intense days. Now, being in Israel during these days is obviously, it's much more intense, much more intensified. I also grew up in a community in Chutz La'aretz, in Teaneck, New Jersey, and we would commemorate Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. There was nothing like the first time that I encountered these days in Israel, especially Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. Very, very, very heartwarming, touching days. And so for this session, I wanted to discuss Ezra HaSofer, because he also lived in a time of Shivat Zion, in a time of return to Israel. So I just want to give a short background. We really have a lot to learn tonight and not so much time. As usual, I just want to give credit to Rabbi Tzvi Sinensky and Rav Alex Israel and Mikra. A lot of the information from this year is coming from there. So basically, Sefer Malachim, it summarizes the end of Sefer Malachim, summarizes the final stages of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and of the Judea area. Prior to that, 18 years prior to that, we saw Nebuchadnezzar. He rises in power. Bavel becomes the superpower of those days, and he draws a siege onto Yerushalayim during the 9th year of the king Tzidkiyahu's reign. And Tzidkiyahu is the final Jewish monarch. In the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu, the Bavlim breach the walls of Yerushalayim. They execute the king's children. They exile he himself, Nevuzan Radan. He leads the Bavli army to destroy the Beit HaMikdash in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And this commander, he exiled the majority of the Jews, and really just the poorest of the Jews were left behind. And Gedaliah, as from Tzum Gedaliah, was appointed as the governor. And yet, unfortunately, he was soon after that assassinated by Ishmael, and it just seemed hopeless for there to be any sort of Jewish presence in Yerushalayim again. I mean, that's why also when we mark Tzum Gedaliah, when we understand the meaning of that day, we understand that that was like the last thread of hope of having some sort of presence, some sort of governing party, of the Jewish governing party, and that was also lost to us. Bavel, after that, it was usurped by Persia as a superpower around 50 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And the only source of hope that we had left was the Nevuah of Yirmiyahu. We have this prophecy that Yirmiyahu promises us that after 70 years, we are going to return to Eretz Yisrael. But the question is, when do those 70 years, when do we begin counting? And that's elusive to us. That's elusive to the Jews that are in Bavel. They're not quite sure when those 70 years are up. It's not clear to anybody when the beginning of those 70 years are counted, so that we can know when it is the conclusion of them. And so the authors of Divrei Yamim and of Ezra understand that Hatzarat Koresh, the declaration of Koresh, to be able to come back and build the Beit HaMikdash, they understand that as a fulfillment of this prophecy of the 70 years. And so after the declaration of Koresh, where you see here, this is also taken from Rav Alex, on year 586 BCE, the first temple is destroyed, and then 50 years later, we have the Cyrus declaration, and the Jews return to Yerushalayim, and in 515, the second Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, and after that, around the year 450, we see the character of Ezra. Ezra, he comes in the second round. He's in the second aliyah, as we would say in modern times, right? We have the first aliyah, the second aliyah, in contemporary times of the return to Israel. Back then, the first group that came with Zerubbabel and Yoshua Kohen, they were the ones that were in charge of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Ezra comes after the Beit HaMikdash has already been built. He's given this license from this Persian king who's hard to say his name, Artaxerxes, and he's given this license, and he's given a lot of power. Ezra does not ask for political power, but he's given a lot of power to lead the second round of Olim to Eretz Israel after the Beit HaMikdash has already been built, and he's given religious power to be able to as well enforce the Jewish law, and those who violate Jewish law will be punished by the Persian government. He returns to a Beit HaMikdash that's in shambles. It's a desperate situation where the Jews when he arrives, they're violating the Shabbos. There's intermarriage is rampant, and the temple is in disrepair. Okay, so that's just a short background, and now we're going to look into the psukim as we usually do when we discuss a character. We find the beginning psukim when they first appear. Ezra only comes into his own book in the 7th chapter. If we look at source number 1, V'achar advarim ha'ele b'malchut Artaxerxes melech Paras. This is during the reign of that king. Here we have Ezra ben Sraya, ben Azariah, ben Chilkiah, and it goes on for 17 generations. The son of, and he has this lengthy genealogy until we finally arrive at Pasuk Hey, ben Avishua, ben Pinchas, ben Elazar, ben Aaron HaKohen HaRosh. He goes all the way back to Aaron, the first priest, as we see here that Ezra is a priest as well. He's a Kohen himself. But the focus of Ezra is not on his role as a priest, but rather on his role as a sofer. And we're going to see that as we go along. In Pasuk Vav, Hu Ezra, this is Ezra, Ala mi Bavel. He came up from Bavel, v'hu sofer mihir b'torat Moshe. He's an expert, a scribe expert in the teaching of Moshe, which the Lord God of Israel had given. Asher natan Hashem Elokei Yisrael, vayiten lo hamelech ki yad Hashem Elokav alav kol bakashato. And so his request, the king had granted in its entirety, thanks to the kindness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So here, Malbim, when he picks up on these words, who Ezra, this is Ezra, and what is he explains that Shimon Tzadik, okay, he was from the remnants of Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, and Ezra is associated with the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, which was a group of 120 members, which interestingly nowadays the Knesset in Israel also has 120 members. And Anshe Knesset HaGdolah is responsible for many wonderful things. Some of them are establishing brachot, prayers, Shmona Esrei, the beginning ceremony to the Shabbos, which is Kiddush, the closing ceremony, which is Havdalah. And the famous statement of in Pirkei Avos Shimon HaTzadik that he says that the world stands on 3 different things. Omed al Torah, ve'al ha'avodah, ve'al gmilut chasadim. It stands on Torah, on Avodah, which, what does that mean? Okay, that's, you can interpret in different ways, and on Gemilut Chasadim, which is also interpreted in different ways. And he goes further to explain that in the times of the Knesset HaGdolah, there was a stronghold of these 3 pillars by 3 specific people. Okay, we have Zerubbabel and Yoshua the Kohen Gadol. They built the Beit HaMikdash, and so therefore the Amud, the pillar of Avodah, of labor, that's the translation of Avodah, is established. Afterwards, we see, what does Ezra establish? V'acharav yatsa Ezra lechonen Amud HaTorah. Ezra went out. Here, his mission is clearly delineated. He goes out in order to uphold, to create this pillar of Torah. And that's what his mission is. His mission is very clear why he is going to Eretz Israel. And afterwards comes Nehemiah, Shabana Chomot Ha'ir, that he builds the walls of the city, and he was a politician, and he worked with policy, and through that he established the pillar of Gemilut Chasadim. Now, from here we see Malbim is explaining to us what this aim is, what the mission is of Ezra, and it's very clear from the Psukim that Ezra was this great Torah scholar. He was a great learner, he was a great Torah scholar, and his impact on the Torah world of halacha and Torah is felt now until our days, but we will get to that. If we go further in the next source, under Moshe versus Ezra, the Gemara draws a comparison between Ezra and Moshe Rabbeinu, which is huge, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest man of our times, as it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yossi, Tanya, Rabbi Yossi, Omer, Ra'oi haya Ezra shetinaten Torah al yado liYisrael. He was worthy that Torah should be given through him to Israel. Ilmale lo kadmo Moshe. Were it not for that Moshe came before him. Wow, that's an amazing statement to say here that Ezra was worthy of giving the Torah to the people. That really shows, that weighs in on his greatness. By Moshe in the pasuk it says, "B'Moshe Omer u'Moshe ala el ha'elokim." During the time of Matan Torah, Moshe goes up. And Ezra, it says as well, Hu Ezra ala mi Bavel. That same word of Allah, aliyah. Ma aliyah ha'amor kan Torah. What is it referring to? The aliyah that's referring to with Moshe, it's referring to Torah. That Moshe was going up on Har Sinai to receive the Torah. Af aliyah ha'amor lahala Torah. So too, there's a connection between here. The aliyah of Ezra to Bavel was also for Torah. And again, and the Gemara goes on and brings in another pasuk where it shows how Moshe came to teach them chukim u'mishpatim. And so too by Ezra, those words again, as you see in the bold, chok u'mishpat. And even though the afal pi shelo nitna Torah liyado, even though the Torah was not given by him, shenishtleta liyado haktav, the font of the Torah, and I won't go into all of the details of what this is referring to, because we are very limited with time, but it is very interesting to look at this idea of how he brought in the Assyrian font into the Torah. The Torah's font was changed. The words stayed the same, but the font of the Torah was changed in order to make the Torah more accessible to the people of the time, that they were not able to recognize the current font, which was called Ktav HaIvri. Okay, so here we see that Ezra was so great that he's even compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. And in a way, we can understand that during his time period, there was like a second Matan Torah, a second giving of the Torah, because Ezra brought the Torah down to the people. He made the Torah relevant to them. When he came and that we were in a complete religious, spiritual drought, crisis, he came and he brought this Torah and he made it accessible. How did he do that? In the Gemara in Talmud Bavli, Masechet Bava Kama, we see here through the rabbinic eyes one of the ways in which he did it, in which he brought the Torah to the people. Asara takanot tikein Ezra. Okay, we have the 10 ordinances that Ezra did, and we're not going to go into all of them. One of them is that he instituted that the communities read the Torah on Shabbos in the afternoon, v'korin b'sheni v'chamishi, and that they read on Mondays and Thursdays. And it goes on, umechabsim b'chamishi, and they do their laundry on Thursdays. Okay, and he goes on into Psukim. Okay, hold on. Okay, and here the question becomes, V'she'eu korin b'sheni v'chamishi Ezra tiken? And then they go into this whole lengthy discussion, and they ask the question, this idea that they should read on Monday and Thursday, did Ezra really institute this practice, right? And they say that it was really instituted previously, long before his time, as it's taught in a different Braita, when it's referring to the pasuk. This is really also a beautiful idea that it says in the pasuk, "Vayilchu shloshet yamim bamidbar v'lo matzu mayim." Right, when it's after Yetziat Mitzrayim, it explains that they walked in the midbar for 3 days and they did not find water. So how do we understand this? What does it mean that they're walking 3 days and they didn't find water? So when you look at it, when you expound on this metaphorically, that it's water here is not the physical idea of water, but it's referring to Torah, right? Because as it says in Yeshayahu, that anyone that's thirsty should come, havikot sameh lechu l'mayim. Okay, so since kevan shalchu shloshat yamim below Torah nilu, since we saw that they walked for 3 days without having water, which is likened to Torah, they became exhausted. So therefore, the prophets of their time, so therefore, what did they do? They instituted that there would be a kriyat Torah, a Torah reading. There would never be 3 days that would go by without a Torah reading. So it would be read on Shabbat, and then there would be the break for Sunday. It would be read on Monday, break Tuesday, Wednesday, read on Thursday, and again on Shabbat. So there's never that lapse of 3 days that goes by. So what is it then that Ezra tiken? What did he add to this? Atahu, if we go down, tiken tarta gavre vasara psuke. What did he bring in here? That there would be 3 men that would read, and they would read at each time a unit would be considered, that there would be 10 psukim. Okay, there's always 3 men, and 10 psukim are read all together. Rav Moshe Taragin brings in an article, and he explains an idea of Rav Soloveitchik, that what's the difference between Moshe's enactment of the Torah reading that we saw here on Monday and Thursday and Ezra's enactment. Originally, they would read the Torah so as not to have this relapse of 3 days without the Torah, but there wasn't a way in which this was conducted. They just made sure that they would have Torah reading, but there weren't rules and limitations and how it was. So Moshe's enactment was really more of an experiential, emotional, spiritual sort of enactment, that we would have this connection, like this lifeline with God, that we would make sure we would, put our charger into the socket so that we can, revitalize ourselves every 3 days. We would really refuel, right? But Ezra's enactment is that he's coming here, he's making sure that there are 10 psukim. He's bringing he's turning that experiential experience into an experience of studying Torah. We can't, if originally they just read a few psukim, okay, it's a nice ma'amad, it's you can enjoy that, but you can't really learn a full idea. And through 10 verses, that's where you're able to gain a full idea to really learn what's going on. Okay, so as we see this emphasis that's placed on this emphasis that Ezra places on Torah study and observance. If we go on in the psukim, from analysis to action, in Ezra Perek Zayin, Pasuk Vav, the psukim go on to explain, Vaya'alu mi b'nei Yisrael, so they go up from Bnei Israel, and then it counts the different people that came from the different sects. You have the Kohanim and the Leviim and the gatekeepers and the singers, and they all go up Bishnat Sheva to the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Vayavo Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi, and they come to Yerushalayim in the 5th month, which is Av. Interestingly, Dot Mikra points out that Ezra has this tendency towards symbolism. And so he made sure that when he left, that his leaving was around the time of Pesach, in order for it to be similar to a Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that his arrival would be in Av, which was the time of the destruction. So there's that symbolism of coming back, returning in the month where the destruction happened. So here we see that he comes back in the 5th month. Ki becha lechodesh harishon, on the 1st day of the 1st month of Nisan, that's when their journey began. Whether the foundations were laid down, the idea was, whatever it's referring to here. And Ezra, ki Ezra hichin levavo lidrosh et Torat Hashem velasot ulelamed b'Yisrael chok u'mishpat. Ezra dedicated himself to study and the teaching of the Torah, and so that here lidrosh et Torat Hashem velasot, to do it and to teach others chok u'mishpat. Okay. Okay, so Rav Tzvi Tsanensky points out that we see already here a shift in this revolution that Ezra is embarking upon when he arrives, a shift but in the word lidrosh. If we look in Perek Vav, okay, which is from the beginning section of the book of Ezra, it's referring to the first group of Olim that made Aliyah. And it explains Vayasu b'nei Golat Pasach. It's referring to when they bring the Korban Pesach on the 14th of the Chodesh Harishon in Nisan. Vayishchatu HaPesach l'chol b'nei Gola lechem HaKohanim v'lehem, and they slaughter the Korban Pesach. And in Pasuk Chaf Aleph, Vayichlu b'nei Yisrael hashavim ma'agola, and b'nei Yisrael who came back from the exile, v'chol hanivdal mitumat goy aretz elehem, and everyone that was able to have from the Korban, lidrosh Lashem Elokei Yisrael. How are they seeking out God? They're seeking out God through korbanot. And that's the way that we always seeked out, that's the way we sought God during the whole time period of the Beit Rishon, the Beit HaMikdash. The first Beit HaMikdash was this glorious place that we would all come to, we would unite, and we would bring korbanot, and that was how we would lidrosh et Hashem. That's how we would seek out God. But here, we see that this lidrosh, the word lidrosh, as Rav Tzvi Tsanensky points out, is not referring to seeking God through korbanot. Rather, there's a shift here. It's seeking God through expounding upon his Torah, to understanding every letter, understanding the meanings, the deeper meanings of what's going on inside of the Torah. And he's doing it, he's expounding it, vilasot, in order to also bring it, vilasot, to do it and to teach it. So the Malbim points out that when it says here in the Pasuk, in Pasuk Yud, it says here, when it's in Pasuk 10, it says, Bal Yerushalayim kiyad Elokav hatova alav, okay, which is an interesting phrase that's repeated in the beginning, the middle, and the end of this perek. It says that thanks to the benevolent care of God, of his God for him, so Malbim explains that this pasuk is connected to that previous line. Why, and what does it mean? What does it mean? How do we explain what's written that Shabbat Kiyad Elokav Tova Alav? It's explaining what's written. It wishes to say that God's personal supervision, his hashkacha pratit, that accompanied him in order to guide him and guard him on the way and to bring him to where he needed to get to, this was all through Bizchut HaTorah. This was in the merit of the Torah that we saw in the previous pasuk. And because he was zoche, he merited this hashkacha, this benevolent hand of God, because he prepared his heart for three things. And what were those three things? The first one is lidrosh et Torat Hashem shedarash v'chakar inyana be'atzmo. He expounded upon the Torah of Hashem. He expounded and studies its matters on his own. Okay, and we see an example of this that we see later on is how he understands the concept of intermarriage. Originally, biblically, it says in the Torah that we're not allowed to come into marriage with the Shivat Amim, the 7 nations, the Canaanite nations that were in Israel at the time, and Ammon and Moab. But there's no prohibition against marrying out into other nations. And he comes, and through this incredible, and we'll get to it Bezrat Hashem next week, through his way of thinking and expounding the Torah, he reaches that conclusion that it also pertains to all nations and the concept of intermarriage. The second thing that he prepares his heart for, vilasot, to do. Shelo hamidrash hu ikar, that the learning is not the main thing. Ela ma'aseh, your actions are what matter. It's not just about what you're learning, because if you don't if you don't apply it, then what does it mean? And the third thing is, and if you learn it, it's not enough just to learn it. U'lelamed b'Yisrael, you also need to teach it. Lelamed lacharim, he needed to teach them how to discern between this idea of a chok and a mishpat. And Asadia Gaon, brilliantly, according to his name, brings in this idea, the word vilasot, and he connects it to the pasuk in Breshit that says, Et hanefesh asher asu b'charan. Who is that referring to? To Avram and Sarah, right? That he's coming here, he's teaching Israel, he's making them, shesa'am, he's creating them, he's converting them, he's bringing them back, he's bringing them closer, tachat zel hashchina, beneath the wings, the shadows of the Shechina. And Avot de Rabbi Natan, it says here in the next source, Aseh Toratcha Keva. How do you establish your learning so that it becomes a fixed practice? How do you do that? Melamed she'im shama adam davar mipi chacham beveit hamidrash, right? When it says aseh toratcha keva, usually the way we understand it is that have a set time, kovei eitim. But here Avot Rabbi Natan brings in another way to understand it, that if someone heard from a scholar in the Beit HaMidrash, he hears advice from someone in the Beit HaMidrash, he should not make it something that's in occasional practice. He should take it to heart. He should make it a fixed practice. He should implement it, internalize it, and bring it into his life. What a person learns, he should do, and then he should also go out and teach others. As we see also in Devarim, and we see in Ezra from this pasuk, that what Ezra did, and that he was able to teach it. So Avot Rabbi Natan is explaining, and it seems like such a simple idea, and yet it's so hard. We learn so much. We hear so many ideas. We go to many shiurim. How often do we take what we learn? V'aseh toratcha keva. How often do we take it to heart, right? We hear about these mitzvot. How often do we perform them? And here, that's what Ezra was about, from analysis to action, to teaching others. He took it the whole way, right? He went home with it. So just to go back a little bit, just to review so far what we've been understanding about Ezra, is that from the time period that he lives in contextually, he lived in a time period where he made Aliyah. He was the leader of a group. He had license to bring about this religious revolution, which he comes to Eretz Yisrael in order to do. Ezra is a man of Torah. He changed the font of the Torah in order to make it accessible to the people. And in some ways, he was like a second Moshe, a second Matan Torah, as we saw that what was stated in the Gemara, that if it weren't for Moshe that came before him, he would have been the one that would have given the Torah. And he also included these takanot, which we didn't go through all of the takanot, but one of the takanot that we focused on was the reading of the Torah, that there should be 3 different readers and 10 psukim, that he, as Rav Soloveitchik pointed out, he turns that the idea of an experiential Kriyat Torah to an experience of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah. So here, as we see the scholar of Ezra, we see in the Gemara that it explains a very interesting concept. And this is a keta from Rav Kook that Rav Alex brought in his shir, that I thought was just a really beautiful idea that he brings in. It says in the Gemara that Ameimar says, the chacham adif minavi, that a chacham, a sage, is greater than a prophet. Okay, that's a very heavy statement. Let's let that sink in for a minute. Okay, and they bring in a pasuk to support this idea. So Rav Kook, in his poetic brilliance and his way of understanding, and it's a long Rav Kook, we won't have time to go through all of it, but I'm happy to send anyone that's interested in reading it through really the Hebrew and the English to really understand what he's saying. But he brings in this idea comparing the sage to the prophet, okay? And he explains, B'noag Shaba'olam, that as a rule, poets know how to portray the nobler side of life. They know how to describe its beauty, its dynamism, its vitality. And they also know how to describe the evils of life and to protest them vigorously, right? That's what poets come to know. They describe it. But the passionate force of the imagination is unable to determine the precise factors and conditions that preserve and stabilize life, and conversely, safeguard it from flaws, defects that are liable to have highly destructive consequences. This is a body of knowledge that concerns itself with the particulars. Here we turn to the work of physicians, economists, engineers, judges, and all those who pursue practical fields. So the way that how Rav Alex explained is that people can come out with these social activist moral cries, right? We want to make sure that we take care of the environment, and poets can come out and songwriters can sing about it, about social justice. But when it comes down to actually making a real difference in these areas, you need the people that are on the grounds. You need the people that are experts in these areas. You need the economists, the engineers, the judges, the doctors, in order to actually make changes on the grounds, okay? The distinctions has even wider applications, okay? So here he brings this to the level of prophecy. That what happened when during the time of prophecy, the prophets saw the evil force of idolatry in ancient Israel, and they protested against it with all of its might. It beheld the majesty and beauty of the one God and articulated its radiance and splendor. If you read the prophets, right, they have beautiful language like poets, and they come out and they describe the evils that they see and the beauty of God. It identified corruption and moral depravity, oppression and exploitation of the poor, murder and adultery, fraud and violent crime. The cries of the prophets were all about tzedek tirdaf, that you should pursue righteousness. You need to pursue tzedek u'mishpat, justice. And with religious passion was inspired to redeem society with its holy message. The question is, did that work? Right? These prophets came out and with these really like beautiful words, inspiring words, and they came and they wanted to really uplift the society, and they came and they warned us. And what happened to those prophets? Many times they were treated horribly by us, by the Jews themselves. They were put into jail, they were tortured. Yirmiyahu, it was like Yirmiyahu is a tragic hero, right? And so here he says, "Hase'arot hadakot," and if you look at the last here pasuk, "Hase'arot hadakot," the fine fibers, shemihen mitztarfot avot agala shel hachatat, which form the great ropes of sin. Okay, so here he uses two different imageries. He uses the fibers that forms a rope. Of which it's for referring to sin, that if you look at a rope is formed of smaller ropes, and when it's like entwined with each other, but it's the small fibers, right? When they all connect to create the ropes of sin, and also the capillaries that weave into the life-giving blood vessels. Gidei ha'chaim hadakim. Okay, these remained hidden from the eye of every prophet and seer. The tiny details, they didn't go into the capillaries in the blood vessels, the little the tiny ropes. It is the practical daily observance of the mitzvot, the commands, with all their detailed laws, that will decisively vanquish the darkness of idolatry. Through the observance, study, habituated performance, and the love of the law, over time, the hidden elegance and grace of the law will be released, along with the energy of the pure divine life force. These are really deep ideas, but what he's explaining is that there are these poets and prophets that came out with these really big ideas, but they didn't see into the detail. And that's what, from our understanding here of Ezra, that's what Ezra came to do. He came here to bring in these takanot, to bring in these enactments in the everyday, that they would read at Mincha and Shabbos. There would be a Kriyat Torah, because that was the time that it was after their meal, people were relaxing, people would show up for a shiur. It was accessible. He understood the ins and outs of the everyday, and how halacha needed to seep in to every capillary. And when we often ask that question of, does it really matter if I turn a light on Shabbos? Yes, it really does. Because it's the same thing as saying, does it really matter when I'm building a clock if I leave out just that one little peg? It's so small, right? But it's that peg, that so tiny small peg that creates the watch, that makes the time move. And that's what he's referring to here. It's the little details that was overseen by these great prophets, that Ezra ushered in this new time period of halacha, of observing halacha, and making us, during the time of the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, when they came and they instituted and they said that you should make a siyag l'Torah, make a fence to the Torah. You should hamidu harbe talmidim. You should have many talmidim. And so it says, it is true that this perception was granted to the prophecy of Moshe, of which God is quoting as saying that he revealed him from mouth to mouth. The prophecy of undimmed clarity that discerned simultaneously the claims of general principles as well as the exacting demands of the particulars. But there never arose another like Moshe, as we are told, there never arose another prophet like Moshe, whom the Lord knew face to face. So here Moshe, what Rav Kook here is referring to is that Moshe was able to embody both. He was able to have that clarity that the prophets had, that direct line to God, right? That we would really expect that, we would ask ourselves that question, wouldn't we prefer to have, right? Like, wouldn't we prefer to have this direct line to God, to have this prophecy, to have this great clarity, right? And we all really like when things are big deals. We all really would love to see the Beit HaMikdash coming crashing out of the sky and just appearing miraculously before us. But it's the small involvement in the little details of life that penetrates us on such a deeper level, more so than the great speeches of the prophets, because we know that these prophets, they came, they knocked on our doors, they begged us to return to God, and they said to us that if you don't destroy your idols, if you don't set up a just society, the Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed. And what happened? The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. It didn't work. We didn't listen. So you might say that, prophecy is this direct line to God, but really it's the laws that bring us, as he says here, I can't highlight it here, but it says that it's the eternal paths lead to him. Halichot olam lo al tikri halichot, don't read it as paths, ela halachot. Read it as the laws. It's the laws that lead us to God, And he goes on to explain that later on, after the course of time, after time passes, eventually what's going to happen is that towards the dawn of the Messianic age, that the wisdom of the sages will become unsavory, and those who live on the boundary will turn from city without finding grace, that this focus on the details will start to lose some of its power and some of its beauty. And this will continue until the radiance of prophecy will reemerge from its hiding and reveal itself, not as an unripe fruit, but as the first fruits full of vitality and life. And prophecy itself will acknowledge the great achievements and effectiveness of the sages. And in righteous humility exclaim, the sage is more important than the prophet. So Rav Kook, and when describing this Messianic age, he explains that we'll be able to create once again this hybrid, this combination of these great spiritual calls and these great ideas and that clarity, along with the focus on the details and the focus on the halacha and the Torah. And so when we look at what Ezra, what Ezra did as he came and he joined and he went up to Eretz Yisrael, he was at a time of transformation, right? He brought about transformation. He brought about these revolutionary acts and he took part in this shift, right? The shift, as we saw before, from the sacrifice to study, that there was now also a focus on Torah learning. There was a focus on the takanot. There's a focus on halacha. And it's interesting when we compare between these two time periods, when we compare between the time period of the Shivat Zion that Ezra was living in, that the Jews started to become comfortable in exile. They were there and they were in Bavel, and they started to really rebuild their lives. They weren't sure when the 70 years were up. They weren't sure when they were meant to return to Eretz Israel. And unfortunately, the Shivat Zion was marked by a very low number of people that actually returned. The majority of the people don't heed this call of to come back. And Ezra heeds this call, and he sees that, yes, there might be right now this vibrant community in exile, but there's a calling for me now to go up and to make sure that I'm part of this huge mahalach that is going on, this huge process that's going on in Eretz Israel. And so he leaves that the comforts of his home, and he also it's like what Pirkei Avos says, when in a place where there isn't a man, be that man. He came into a vacuum, in a place where, as we explained earlier, that the Beit HaMikdash was in shambles. It wasn't functioning properly. People were not keeping Shabbos. Intermarriage was rampant. He could have said, you know what? It's more comfortable for me in my Beit Midrash in Bavel, where everyone there is keeping the Shabbos, and everyone there is, learning Torah and observing the Torah. But instead of staying within those Daled Amot, that, his own comfortable corner, he goes up and he decides to bring that corner and to expand it and to have many Talmidim. And B'zchut Ezra's Torah, we really have the Torah. We can thank him for what we have today, because what he did was he saved the Torah. He made it relevant, accessible, and something that we could implement into our lives. And so when we see what Ezra, that he heeded this call to go up, I think that in our generation, in our time, in contemporary times, there's such a similarity between what happened then and what's happening since the return to Israel from the first Aliyah, right? That the Aliyah to Israel didn't happen all in one, just like we saw in Ezra, that it happened in different, as you say in Israel, in Hebrew, naglot, right? In different rounds that it happened. And we have this, I could almost hear Moshe Rabbeinu's voice, Moshe, as we referred to him before, when similarly before we have this issue of the Jews not necessarily heeding that call of being able to cross over into Eretz Israel. As Moshe says to Gad and Reuven and Chatzi Menashe, that when they wanted to stay on the other side of the Yarden and they saw the lush land there and the comforts of the land there, Moshe says to them, Vayomer Moshe livnei Gad livnei Reuven, ha'achechem yavo lemilchama v'atem tishvu po. Your brothers are going to go out to battle and you're going to stay here. And that, on a personal level, that was something that when I felt very strongly on those 2 days of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, the first time that I was able to be in Eretz Israel during that time, that I was able to stand for the siren and watch the entire country. It's the most magnificent experience one can really people are driving, and I don't know if you've driven in Israel, but it's scary, right? People are driving really fast, and everybody just stops to hear that siren. Everyone gives that moment to hear that call, to give thanks and to remember those people that were the Ezras, the people, the Zerubbabels, the people that went up, that heeded that call, and that are the next generations as well. And I think that we all have this question of asking ourselves, there's this huge mahalach, this huge process that's going on now in Medinat Israel. And my question is, will I stay in my comfortable Daled Amot, or will I rise up and will I go and contribute my own takano, my own contributions to this beautiful mahalach, this beautiful process that's going on in Medinat Israel of our modern day times of Shivat Zion? Okay, does anybody have any questions?